really into Methodist history. In fact, the bishop that we have now is the one who taught the class that my son has to take to be ordained as a Methodist minister on Methodist history.
I'm sorry, I can't.
Okay, get it closer.
Yes.
There we go. Okay, I would have trouble with these microphones. Thank you. Obviously, I have more material that can be covered, and when my hour is up, I'll stop talking, I hope. So.
We'll set a timer.
Set a timer, yes. Okay. The Methodist Church has a founder named John Wesley. He's the second son of Samuel. This is going to be tricky. Remembering to do that. Anyway, he's the second son of Samuel, who's a former nonconformist or a descendant from the Church of England. And I think those terms may come clearer when we talk about the other church.
Yeah, Eric, is there a different thing we can do with this microphone? It seems to cut out.
We can try doing
The headset?
the headset, the one that goes over the ear.
Try to try one of those.
Sure, I'm more comfortable with that. But,
Okay, sure.
and I'm shaking a lot today.
Okay.
Can you put it in the stand and just pull it over by you, Paul?
We'll get set up with a headset, and then it'll follow him.
It will follow me wherever I go.
There you go.
Anyway, Samuel was the rector at Epworth, and the mother was Susanna Wesley. Now, Susanna Wesley is considered the mother of Methodism. So, origin story about who Susanna, his quote is that he learned more about Christianity from his mother than all the theologians in England. So, obviously she was kind of important to him. She's the one who was responsible for their early education and their spiritual formation, and their success is owed to their mother and the foundation that she built in their childhood. Had a spreadsheet before there were spreadsheets on how to raise all the kids that she had given birth to. She had an incredible organizational schedule for dressing and changing clothes. She herself was the youngest of 25 kids.
Paul? Paul?
They had,
You can put this over your head.
yeah. Thank you.
And we'll leave this one on in case there's questions or something.
Okay.
And I'm gonna have you talk for a little bit so I can adjust the volume, make sure it's good for your speaking voice.
Oh, it's gone, there it goes.
So,
Go ahead.
okay, go ahead. She married this English pastor, Samuel Wesley, and they had 19 children. So, I don't know. I should have looked it up how many actually lived, because you hear these big numbers and a lot of them don't make it to adulthood. But she made sure that each child was nurtured individually. And she would mark out at least an hour that was just that kid's time. It doesn't mean that she didn't spend time with it at other times, but she was, there would be, for example, Tuesday at 3 would be John Wesley's time. It doesn't mean she was ignoring anybody else. That was his time to be with his mom and learn. And she did that with each and every child. She led by example. Her life and faith journey shaped Methodism in the way we see it today. For instance, we see in her and her sons a tension between the Puritan evangelism of the Church of England and the Church of England prayer book. So you got the Puritan versus the Church of England prayer book. Spirituality and sacramentalism. And this was something new that I kind of picked up when I was trying to work on this, is that Methodists are often what we would say both and. We're combining some things. We're not an either or. It has to be this way or you're going to hell kind of approach. It's both and. Ended up long before women were ordained, Susanna gathered friends in her kitchen table, led prayers, and when her preacher husband were away, she kept the parish going in his absence. In essence, she became the pastor for Epworth. She also planted the unconventional idea of letting lay people serve as local preachers. It's recorded that when John started traveling the circuit and preaching, he was late. And he showed up, and a gentleman he knew, a layman, was filling in for him. Well, he was really upset. The layman was kind of almost preaching, and he didn't think that was right. And his mother told him to take another look. And he listened and realized that that guy was doing a good thing. And that's the channel that led to Methodists using lots and lots of lay people. If you see who's serving the churches at the moment in Montana, they are basically all lay pastors. There are very, very few ordained elders. The other event in his childhood that influenced him is he almost got burned up. The rector, maybe this appealed to me because I was a pastor's kid and I kept thinking maybe they'll burn down the parsonage because something my dad did. And the rumor is that that's what was going on here, is that Samuel had made some people mad, and so they burned down the rectory. So, you know, but he got rescued. They made a human ladder, some of the people, and brought him from a second-story window. And after the fire, Susanna sometimes referred, and Jackie is what she called him. The rest of us don't get to call him Jackie. He's John. Is a brand plucked from the fire, from the burning, a reference to Zechariah 3:2. She believed God saved her son for a reason, a lesson that Jackie learned well. He wrote 45 years later, he was remembering his mother's words. He was lying in a bed sick with consumption, which is a generic term they used in those days for a person who's wasting away. And he wrote an epitaph for himself where he used these words in case he didn't recover. So the inscription he penned in his journal to go on his tombstone was, "Here lieth the body of John Wesley, a brand plucked out of the burning." So he had that feeling given to him by his mom that he was special in some way and had a special purpose in life. And that's part of the reason he was rescued.
Paul, does that have any connection with the logo, the emblem?
No. But there'll be lots of fires. I can give you a quote right now that he says, "Be on fire for Christ and people will come to watch it burn." But we're heading quickly to where, I just like that quote, because I don't think I was ever on fire. Nobody came to watch me burn that I'm aware of. But I love the quote.
So what was the year frame? What year was this? Was this 1600s,
Okay,
1500s?
we're talking.
Roundabout-ish.
He was born in 1703.
Okay.
So we're talking
Okay.
basically the 18th century.
Paul, I did a little bit of research while you were talking. Out of 19 children, 10 survived to adulthood, 9 died in infancy or soon after.
Though I knew it would be a number like that. But, and you can have lots of fun on the internet. Wesley is everywhere on the internet. Anyway, he goes to Oxford. And his brother Charles is there, or Robert Kirkman, or William Morgan, and later on somebody by the name of Whitfield shows up. And they form what they call the Holy Club. Now, in The rest of the students thought this was a little silly and decided to tease him and came up with the name Methodist because of their emphasis on a methodical study and devotion. They had frequent communion service. I don't know how obviously it didn't sit all that well with the other students. They had frequent communion service. They fasted 2 days a week. They added social service in 1730 to their activities. They visited Oxford prisoners, teaching them to read, paying their debts, and attempting to find employment for them. The Methodists also extended their activities to workhouses and poor people, distributing food, clothing, medicine, and also running a school. When the Wesleys left, the Holy Club disintegrated. But where did they leave to? His dad had died. He got talked in going to Georgia. This is not good. It was not a good experience for John. The most important thing probably is that he got and met Moravians on the boat, and I don't know if you remember like the story of Jesus being calm and everybody else being scared on the boat. Well, that's kind of what happened, and John was on the scared side, and the Moravians seemed calm, and he wanted that calmness. He wanted that faith. So that will become a part of what he is searching for in his life. He had no success working with the indigenous people or actually serving the flock there. It was what some might call a disaster. And he got kicked out because he fell for Sophie, was the niece of the chief magistrate who decided to marry some other man. And so he decided that he wouldn't serve her communion. And so they decided he was no longer welcome in Georgia.
You're talking Georgia in the United States?
Yeah, the state of Georgia. Oglethorpe was the governor of Georgia in those days. So he fled Georgia and comes back to England.
So is he serving,
He's ordained.
and he was serving Church of, Anglican churches? Okay,
Well, sort of.
sort of. Okay.
John has his problems following authority at times.
Right.
Anyway, so he comes back to London, and he meets a Moravian, Peter Bowler, convinced him that he needed was simple faith. In fact, Peter Bowler's the one that told him to keep preaching faith until you have faith. It's the famous quote to John Wesley. And so he discovered, and we'll read this in a minute, Martin Luther's commentary, The Letter of Paul to the Galatians, with emphasis on the scripture doctrine of justification by grace through faith. On May 24, 1738, in Aldersgate Street, London, during a meeting composed largely of Moravians under the auspices of the Church of England. This is where the flame comes from. And I will read the famous words that have been quoted to me by other Methodists even. Just as I went out, I opened again on these, we'll skip down. He kept journals. I was hitting earlier in the day. We'll go to the evening. In the evening, I went very unwillingly. That's how I go to church, unwillingly. No. To a society in Aldersgate Street where we were reading Luther's preface to the epistles to the Romans, where 9:15, while we were describing the change which God works in the hearts through faith in Christ, I felt my heart strangely warmed. I felt I did trust in Christ. Christ alone for salvation and for assurance was given me that he has taken away my sins, even mine, saved me from the law of sin and death. I began to pray with all my might for those who had in a more especially manner despitefully used me and persecuted me. I then testified openly to all there that I now first felt in my heart. But it was not long before the enemy suggested, "This cannot be faith, for where is thy joy?" Then I was taught that peace and victory over sin are essential to faith in the captain of our salvation. But there is the transport of joy that usually attends the beginning of it, especially in those who have mourned deeply. God sometimes giveth, sometimes withholdeth, then according to the counsel of his own will. After my return home, I am buffeted with temptation, but I cried out, and they fled away. They returned again and again. As I often lifted my eyes, he said, "Send me help for this holy place." And therein I found the difference between this and my former state of the law as well as under grace. But then I was sometimes, if not often, conquered. Now I was always the conqueror.
People just don't journal like they used to.
He journaled every, I keep wanting to call it a diary, but it was called a journal in those days. And he has, it makes it really easy for historians because we have his journals and we can go back and read what he was thinking and what he, believed. But we also have all his sermons, basically. So we can go back and read all them. And I might dip into a sermon later, but not at the moment. We'll move on. So from that point onward, he viewed his mission of life as one as proclaiming the good news of salvation by faith, which he did wherever a pulpit was offered him. Now here comes the catch. The congregations of the Church of England, however, soon closed the doors to him because of his enthusiasm. The flame. So he went to religious societies trying to inject a new spiritual vigor in them, particularly by introducing bands similar to those of the Moravians. These small groups within each society were confined to members of the same sect and marital status and were prepared to share intimate details of their lives with others and receive mutual rebukes on where they had fallen short. Well, so how do we get to John Wesley's idea that the world is his parish? Well, that's because he got kicked out of all those parishes. And the Church of England had people that were stoning and so on. So much later, George Whitefield, another Anglican clergyman who had undergone a conversion experience, invited his friend John Wesley to come to the city of Bristol to preach to the colliers of the Kingswood Chase who lived and worked in the most debased conditions. Wesley accepted this invitation, found himself much against his will, preaching in the open air. Hey, you can have God somewhere other than in a church. You can preach somewhere other than in a church. The end. This enterprise was the beginning of the Methodist revival. Whitefield and Wesley first worked together, but later separated over Whitefield's belief in double predestination. And that's the belief that God has predetermined from eternity whom he will save. And Wesley is very adamant against that particular doctrine. He wrote his first rules for his little societies, band societies, were written in December 1738. So, while Wesley never leaves the Church of England, he's setting both for the church in America and here, he's starting to set up the network that becomes the church, the Methodist Church after his death, and in the case of England, and we'll see more maybe next week. Anyway, resistance to his societies, these church societies, grew. It was a part of a great awakening in both Great Britain and North America. It's the historical term that's used for for this time period. It's the first of the two Great Awakenings. And Wesley is persuaded to go to the unchurched masses. So he gathers the converts into societies for continuing growth and fellowship. He's asked by the London group to become their leader, and soon there are other groups who were formed in London, Bristol, and elsewhere. And to avoid the scandal of the unworthy member, heaven forbid we have any unworthy members. I probably would have been one. Anyway, Wesley published the 1743 Rules for the Methodist Societies. To promote new societies, he became widely traveling itinerant preacher. Because most ordained clergy did not favor his approach, Wesley was compelled to seek the services of dedicated laymen who also became itinerant preachers and helped administer the Methodist societies. The movement grows rapidly. Wesley differs only from those in that he claimed to have reinstated biblical doctrines that human beings may be assured of their salvation by the power of the Holy Spirit, enables them to attain perfect love for God and their fellows in this life. Wesley's helpers included a few ordained clergymen, his brother Charles, who wrote more than 6,000 hymns to express the message of revival. The New Century Hymnal has, I think, 5 or 6 of that.
Of the 6,000 hymns.
Yeah, the 6,000 hymns. And the tune for Church's One Foundation is written by his son that you use in the New Century Hymnal. So, that's kind of some of the gist, but now I'd like to probably get into more what I'd call the ideas of Wesley. One of my favorite quotes of Wesley is, "Do all the good you can by all the means you can, in all the ways you can, in all the places you can, to tell the people, to all the people you can, as long as ever you can." Anybody want to make that on a little thing for me, and I'll hang it on my wall? Wesley's theories that we had became a study for one of our general conferences. We were to study his rules, and this gives you an idea of how the rules worked that he was writing early on. Oh, I forgot to mention, the reason it's number 1 in the hymnal, "Oh, 4,000 tongues to sing," that was Charles Wesley. That was a big to-do when the new hymnal. I call it new hymnal. That shows you how old I am.
Yeah, because that came out in what, 80?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I'm getting older all the time. Anyway, the first rule is do no harm. Second rule is do good. And the final rule was stay in love with God. So that gives you an idea of the kinds of rules that he would come up with. There are 2 things, theologically wise, that I think are related to Wesley at this point. One is he defined grace in 3 different ways, or he divided it out in meaning. So we have prevenient grace, justifying grace, and sanctifying grace. Prevenient grace goes back to that double predestination. He thinks all people are loved by God and invited to God, by God to be saved. The image that's often used by Methodist preachers, because we're not very inventive, is when you're walking by on the sidewalk and the people up on the porch are inviting you to come up and stop and talk. That's the prevenient grace, the grace. If you make it up onto the porch, that's where you might become justified. Sanctifying is living in the house, living by the house rules, doing things that need to be done to make it a good house. That's the acts of love. And that's really important to Wesley. When you get ordained in the United Methodist Church, the questions that Wesley wrote are still the ones you have to answer. So you get the one, are you so in debt as to embarrass yourself in your ministry? Which gets lots of laughters these days with the student loan crisis that most of these kids have that are graduating. That's because his dad spent time in debtor's prison. You get another one, it's always been a struggle for me, but I knew what I was supposed to say. And that's the question, are you going on to perfection? So he's saying, yeah, you're justified, but I want to see it in sanctification, in what you do. So there was a change in, he expected some changes of behavior to show up from being converted. And one of the examples, I guess, I don't know if you heard me when I said they did schools. Well, when they did a Sunday school, it literally was school. It was to learn to read and write and that kind of stuff. So, and you will see next how it involved hospitals, working with the poor, and everything else. So the social change that Wesley brought in his attempt to make sure that the sanctification happened is, by some historians, that said is the reason that there wasn't a British Revolution like the French Revolution at that same general time period in that century, because he brought and made the changes happen. He was an abolitionist. He was ahead of his time in a variety of things. Now we have what is called, and it's credited to John Wesley. It actually was developed, the idea of it, by an American Methodist scholar, Albert Outler, in the 20th century, called the Wesleyan Quadrilateral. This idea is that there are 4 sources of basic theological and doctrinal development. And the 4 sources are chiefly Scripture, along with tradition, reason, and the Christian experience. Having that conversion experience was really important to him. And Scripture, tradition, reason, and experience.
That will be on the test.
And Christian experience is?
The conversion experience he had are experiences that you have. He's validating all those lay people who have experienced God in a variety of ways, that's a part of the faith and feeds what you believe and who you are, is what's behind it. But the sad part, to me at times, that's where Pentecost churches come from. So and Salvation Army comes from. And
that all comes out of Wesley as well.
That's all out of the Wesley. Church of the Nazarene is out of the Wesley.
Paul, could that have an influence from Wesley's meeting with the German bishop who asked if he had achieved inner personal connection to Jesus Christ?
Okay, what he really did after Aldersgate is he went to Germany to be with the Moravians for a few months, and then he came back. And then he really got on his high horse, so to speak. Yeah, because Billy Graham's goal was to preach more sermons than Wesley before he died. I think he fell short. But even if he didn't, I figure Wesley gets more credit because he was riding a horse hither and yon. The mode of transportation was a little tougher to work with. So the picture of a preacher on a horse is sort of in my mind, is a Methodist image.
Well, it's the Cokesbury emblem.
Yes, that's why it's the Cokesbury emblem, and we'll get into it. The circuit riders and that kind of stuff. But so I didn't answer your question, did it?
No, but that's okay.
I'm good at not answering questions. So we're going to go, I think I got the time. We're going to wander off into something that is history of sorts here, because he preached a sermon on money, the least favorite topic for a preacher to preach on. And in that sermon, you can find the quote, "Earn all you can, save all you can, give all you can." And he and as he got near death, he was getting worried because the Methodists were doing really good at earning all you could and saving all you could, but we weren't doing too good at give all you could. But anyway, so that gives to how he handled money. He started out, and I think the example is 28 pounds that he lived on, and he had 30, and he gave away the other 2. The next year he had like 60 pounds, still lived on the 28 pounds, and gave the rest away. And so on in his life, he tried to live as frugally as possible. And Wesley was making quite a bit of money, strangely enough. Anybody want to guess how he made his money? No. Yeah, his medical book was the best-selling medical book of the time. So, yeah, and natural healing methods and all kinds of stuff. So, the example would be he was making like $150,000 in today's money off the royalties from his writings, particularly a year.
That's a lot of money. Wow.
Yeah, it's a lot of money.
Today's money.
In today's money. That's why I decided to move it into today's money. Talking pounds back then.
Oh, so it was the equivalent of 150,000. Okay.
Yeah, 150,000 in today's money. Still a lot of money. So how much do you want to guess that he lived on? No. A little better than that. He lived on 20,000 a year. 20,000 a year. So, and the rest of it he gave away.
So we do not need to use that as a model for clergy compensation?
Well, nobody that I know has followed that model except John. Nobody followed his schedule of life either. He slept 5 to 6 hours a night, 2 hours of prayer, and then after that 2 hours of prayer, then he thought he could get on with the rest of his day's work. He did 3 to 4 sermons a day. That was a normal day for him. So, yeah, another one of those ordination questions you get is, are you wasting any of your time? John Wesley didn't waste any time. I figured I wasted way too much time, but I just still answered it in the way I was supposed to. So that gives you some idea of his character. of who he was and what he believed. And obviously, a big thing that's coming up, what happens? Did anybody remember? Okay, the next session we'll start dealing with what happened and how he moved over, or how he dealt with the American Revolution and the decisions and things that he did. Some of them controversial still to some people. To help spread Methodism in the United States. So that's kind of the rough history. I didn't make it to Aldersgate when I was in London. I got lost coming back. So I've never been to Aldersgate, but I tried. My wife can testify that I got lost. And they actually have an Aldersgate Sunday that still shows up on the calendar for the Methodist Church. I don't think many times it gets followed, but it's there for those who want. May 24th. Oh, it's there in May. Obviously, it can't be always hot right then, but yeah. Any questions? Does that give you kind of a picture of who he's a revivalist, he's a preacher, and he's very much concerned for the poor.
He really is a hard person to live up to.
Nobody I know has.
Yeah.
I mean, we have, here in Montana, we got Brother Van, so. And Brother Van and Wesley have something in common. They both couldn't handle being married very well. So
Wesley had been married.
Well, this is a really, he actually did get married at age 48. And he spent too much time on the church and no time with her. She didn't like that. I wonder why. In fact, they weren't living together, and when she died, he didn't find out about it right away, and he didn't attend her funeral. So, to make of that what you will. So he has some human sides and failings, and one of them is personal relationships. So, no children. Whereas Charles gets married, has children, and it's one of his children that writes the tune and so on. But and Charles then stayed basically in one or two places his life, whereas Wesley was always on the move.
Did I imagine this, or did you tell me once that Charles would borrow the tunes from the drinking songs and stuff?
Oh, yeah, that's another. His theory was that the devil shouldn't own all the good tunes. So out of those 6,000 and some hymns, and heavens knows which ones, I don't, if there was a song that was big at the pub and he liked the tune, he would put Christian words to it and try to teach theology. So if you're singing Hark the Herald Angels Sing, you're also getting Charles Wesley's theology. When you sing Christ the Lord is risen today, if you pay attention to the words, you're getting Christ. Charles Wesley's theology and the theology of the Wesley Revival. If you go sing for 1,000 times to sing, same thing.
So in other words, though, he spent a lot of time in the pub.
Must have.
Must have.
He did a lot of his evangelism at the pub.
Mostly it was outdoors.
You could use a few pub songs on Sunday.
Yeah, we have a church or two that we've started that's where they meet, but in this conference that wasn't Wesley. drew crowds outdoors, big crowds, ultimately. He went, though, from being stones thrown at him to becoming a very respected person within the British system, or the British world, during his lifetime. And his picture is in the portrait gallery there. When you go to London and go through the portrait gallery, you can see a picture of him. It's not impressive. So that's, but yeah, and that's why in the front of that hymnal, the New Methodist hymnal, you'll find,
1985.
from 1985, thank you, you'll have the rules for singing.
Oh, yeah.
And that's where they go back to, guess who? John Wesley. So, the documents of things that John Wesley wrote are everywhere within the Methodist system. And I would say, in one sense, by setting up these societies and running these annual conferences that he did early on, even though he never actually split from the Church of England, he was acting as the first bishop, because he was setting the rules. He set the ordination questions and so on that we have to answer. So,
Paul, would you talk more about the quadrilateral in a current context? Because that 4-point is so key to being a Methodist.
yeah, that's the other name for it, by the way, is Methodist quadrilateral. I can tell you the part I like is reason. And because one of the wars I fought from my childhood on was the fight with those who would not support evolution as a scientific principle. And so that one particularly appeals to me, because in defense of science, it's a defense of science to me, that Methodism allows reason to have a say.
Scripture, reason, experience, and
Tradition.
tradition.
And I always think of tradition, I think of the Christmas.
Okay.
We're not doing it on the day that Christ was born, because we don't know the day that Christ was born, and so forth and so on. We combine two different Christmas stories and think nothing of it, and so on. But that's tradition, and we're all perfectly happy with it and live with it.
Because we've always done it that way.
Yes. And and he was tied tradition. That's why he never actually left the Church of England. He was particularly tied to communion.
Did he get kicked out, though? I mean,
No,
okay, so he didn't get
he didn't get defrocked,
defrocked. Okay.
but he didn't get assigned a parish either, other than his assignment to himself of the world as his parish.
Tolerated.
He became more and more tolerated, but at first he wasn't tolerated at all. Does that help anymore?
But today, isn't the United Methodist Church and the Episcopal Church in partnership, or don't they?
We're working that way.
Agreement? Okay.
And in fact, they have to vote yet. The Episcopal,
Okay.
they haven't voted. And then in the Church of England and the Methodists have voted to go in with the Church of England.
Okay.
The Church of England has not gotten a majority vote. They voted 3 times, so they're still separate
Okay.
in England. So,
And we thought our merger was taking a long time.
that's right. I think it's 2027 the Episcopals are going to vote, or somewhere in that.
That example, though, of Wesley saying, well, maybe tradition says we always did it this way, but we don't have to do it this way. And
He's an ant, remember?
yeah.
This is the tradition, and we can do this. We're not going to hell if we don't. So he does a lot of ending, where he takes the Puritan in his revivalism, or the Puritanism in the book of, which he ended up rewriting, the Book of Common Prayer of the church. So he has that. He's always he has a lot of conflicts in his thinking, and the James passage about works, and you can't be saved by works, but he really pushes works and personal piety. The story, one of my favorite ones that I read is the Methodist laity got to the point they were changing their lives and becoming, I don't know, more middle class. And then they get upset because their daughters wanted to date men that were just like them before they converted. So that became sort of a cycle problem. but that's what was going on. So he was,
Did he ever speak on slavery?
he's a bit abolitionist early on, but obviously in the 18th century it's not as big as it's going to be. And that's what amazes me, that the Methodist Church, who worships Wesley, splits. We're going to have a lot of splits next time, and slavery is in the role of a black person enters into a lot of splits. But he was strong. He comes out really good on social issues, from my perspective. Any more questions? I was just trying to give you a hint of who Wesley is, because he was fun to me. This image of somebody that I can't possibly live up to.
Maybe this is next week, but I'm just thinking about, that a church that eventually then is really concentrated out of the teachings of a person. Was there outside accusations of being a cult, or you're worshiping Wesley and not Jesus, or anything like that? Does that come up?
No, because basically he follows all the teachings of the Church of England.
Okay.
So he didn't. So he doesn't really come up with a whole lot that's different. In the Book of Discipline, it has, I can't remember what it's called, but anyway, the list of what we believe and it's just Church of England stuff, Episcopal stuff. I would say there's no dramatic, unless it's what I was talking about in Grace and this emphasis on being perfected in love. There's no easy target that direction.
Okay.
Does that make sense to everybody? Mm-hmm. So he wasn't. Now, church organization and organizing these societies, acting as a bishop and creating bishops that were actually lay people, that caused some controversy. That still hasn't been resolved, given what I just told you about this vote between the Church of England and Britain and Methodists.
So with all the rules that he came up with, would it have been considered at that time that it was a very rigid theology, or progressive even at that time?
It was progressive in that it trusted in the layperson and wanted to help. I don't know if the poorhouses where you were in, and so on, hospitals, visiting people in jail. He was trying to live out that in his life, and then he had got other people living that out in their lives.
But where he had the base of the lay people doing, it still was that model of episcopacy coming down.
Okay, we're going to get into the hierarchy later. But yeah, we have, and Methodists have struggled with the hierarchy thing. At the moment, we're struggling with it because we don't think we can afford it anymore. We don't have the money to do it. And there's this latest break that we're working with through has raised those questions again. So, yeah, with that book of discipline that is this big, used to be just that little teeny thing.
And it's not because they made the print bigger.
No, it has nothing to do with print. It's amazing what we can put into things, but Wesley had hymnals. He had the book of discipline early on. All of the one bishop said that all the Methodists need were a book of worship, a hymnal, and the book of discipline. Those were the books that you needed to. And Wesley created all of them as a part of what he was doing. And the one that's most beloved now is the hymnal. I don't know. I've learned to hate the discipline, but live with it. And I do, the Methodist Church has struggled with the liturgy, and the role of the liturgy, but has a great love of music. I don't know how many of you have seen the play Our Town. There's a line in there about the Methodist singing too loud, with too much enthusiasm. The fire. Yeah, your Sunday sermon, Burning Hearts. Yeah. I had the song that you had us close with, Here I Am, Lord. I had a grocery clerk in Spearfish, Wyoming, tell me that she thought of that as the anthem of the Methodist Church, and I thought, I can live with that idea. I was kind of happy with that, but there is that call to all people. Here I am, Lord. Send me.
Okay. Does anybody know how to turn the heat on? Or is the air conditioning off?
Yeah, and so we'll just do this for a few minutes. How's that? Okay. If it starts to get a little bit warm, we'll turn those back on. If anybody needs a couple of minutes to refill your coffee, how's the coffee looking over there?
There's about maybe 1.5 cups.
1.5 cups. Do we need to make another pot of coffee? Okay. Or a bathroom run. Oh, let's see. I need this.
Oh. I certainly don't know how to do it anymore.
Thanks, Paul. UCC, the roots of the UCC are a little bit different. We don't trace our stuff back to an individual. We trace our stuff back to denominations that emerged primarily out of Europe, and we generally trace them back to, we used to talk about 4 streams. I'm going to lower this. Well, there we go. we used to talk about 4 streams that came together, which is always funny to me because we know living by this big river that streams come together to form rivers. But before they came together to form rivers, it was all out of kind of some separations from things. So we've talked about these 4 streams that the United Church of Christ came out of. About 5, 6 years ago, we discovered, or we were reminded, that there was a 5th stream in our history that has been ignored, and I'll get into that. So that's the teaser out there. So I wanted to share a handout. I think I have enough. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Oh, look at this. It's exactly. Except that, I don't have it. Ooh, sorry, I walked in front of the speaker. Sorry about that, Eric. That just blasted his eardrums. So this shows lots of streams in it. And so this is where it's funky, because this is actually a stream going backwards kind of thing. So over on the left, it shows just the way. So that's basically early Christianity. So it shows that as kind of like this lake that these streams emerge out of. Well, we all know that streams don't function that way. It's not like you have a bigger body of water that separates into smaller bodies of water. It goes the other way around. But for the illustration, so this goes back to early Christianity, and then it shows the separation out into the Great Schism of 1054, and then the Reformation and all of that. And you can see that Methodism is there. It's about in the middle of the page, kind of towards the, I need to stop walking in front of the speaker. I'm sorry. I'll walk over this way. So the UCC kind of, when we're doing UCC history, we kind of go back and say, oh yeah, we started with Jesus. Jesus is, in the United Church of Christ, we proclaim that Jesus is the head of the church and is the sole head of the church. So we trace the history back to there, and I'm sure that Methodism would as well. And then there's some splits along the way. A theological historian by the name of Phyllis Tickle figured out and pointed out a few years ago that every 500 years the church is reformed. And the fun thing is she talked about that the church has a massive yard sale. So when you're kind of trying like to clean out your house, you take everything in the house, you set it out on the lawn, and you figure it out what it is that you want to keep and bring it back into the house, and then the rest of it just becomes a big gigantic yard sale. And so she talks about all of these movements about every 500 years as the church's big yard sales. So there was kind of one around 500, it's actually a little bit before 500, when Constantine, the Emperor Constantine, said that Christianity is going to be the official religion of the Roman Empire. And then in 10,000 there was, or in 1,000 there was the Great Schism that separated the Roman Church from the Eastern Church because they couldn't agree on like papal authority. So like the Eastern Church, honored the Pope, but did not believe that the Pope had ultimate authority over all of the churches. Plus they really weren't quite sure, of some of they had some differences on some of the liturgical practices, like get this, let's see, verses 11, Brendan. So the church in the West, so Rome, introduced the use of unleavened bread for the Eucharist, and the Eastern Church wanted to use leavened bread. So part of the schism of the church was over what kind of bread are we going to serve for communion. Okay. There was also some messing around with the Nicene Creed. So the Nicene Creed had been written, I don't remember what year, but a few hundred years before this. And it was basically written kind of as a testament to what is Christianity, what is a Christian. So it was when Christianity was getting big enough that and there was different versions of it scattered around. And so the bigwigs in the church were trying to figure out, so who's in and who's out, essentially. And so they came up with the Nicene Creed. And part of that Nicene Creed dealt with trying to figure out how do we describe what we've come to know as the Trinity of God the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Well, and this was part of the controversy that split the church between East and West. The Western Church, or Rome, added the words "and the Son" to the creed, indicating that the Holy Spirit proceeded from both God the Father and from the Son, or from Jesus. And the Greek held to it that the Holy Spirit only came from the Father. Again, these are the things that split churches. And then there were some cultural and political divisions. Anyway, so the church split around the year 1000. And then in the early 1500s, there was another split. Who knows what that split is? The Reformation. Yep, good old Martin Luther and his opinion pasted up on the church door in Wittenberg. So what was happening was that the Christian church had discovered in the Western church, so the Eastern church, so the Orthodox church, the Greek church, they're kind of off doing their own thing. So you'll see that in the streams kind of up along the top. They're just kind of off, kind of doing their own thing. But the Western church, there were Christians that felt that the Western church, Rome, essentially, had become corrupt and was deeply involved in economic and political interests. So the church leaders protested. That's where we get the word Protestant. So the church leaders protested. They intended it to be a reformation within the church. They did not intend for it to be a schism. They did not intend for it to be a breakaway. They wanted the church to reform. They wanted the church, the hierarchy, the leadership of the church to confess and change their ways. And as we know, with people who are in power, and especially if that power is connected to a political mechanism, they are not going to confess that they have done wrong, because that means they might lose their power. So they didn't. And it was like, okay, we're done, we're out of here. There was a lot of reformation going on at the time. We kind of hang it onto Martin Luther. He was just one of the key players. There were also other people like, and I love just saying this name, Ulrich Zwingli and John Calvin. Okay, so we're going to come back to those names in a little bit. All of those reformers held that the Bible, not the Pope, was sufficient authority for the church. So hang on to that, because that's gonna play itself out as we go through how the UCC came to be. So this Reformation movement was moving throughout Europe. So it was going on. So of the 5 streams, we're going to talk about the Congregationalists. So woohoo, that's, the church here is a congregational church. So it is descended from these Congregationalists that I'm going to be talking about a little bit more in depth. But the UCC is more than that. UCC is more than Congregationalists. One of the streams was the Reformed Church. One of the streams was evangelical. Which one does yours come out of? Is yours evangelical? But before it was ENR, was it evangelical? I'm guessing, because it was Wisconsin, I'm guessing it's evangelical. And Christian is stream number 4, and I'll get into all of the details. This is the new one that has been added to our history narrative, is the Afro-Christian convention. So that's a new. So those of you in the UCC that were confirmed, before 5 years ago. Any of you been confirmed since 5 years ago? You would have been taught about 4 of those 5 streams. You would not most likely have been taught about the Afro-Christian stream. So back to the Congregationalists. Begins in England. So if I say the word Congregationalist, does anything come to mind about who those historical people were? Puritans or Pilgrims, exactly. So it begins in England at the end of the 16th century. The Church of England at this time had separated from Rome, and there were folks who believed that the Church of England just really fell short of a New Testament ideal. So their intent was to return to the kind of church described in the Bible. And part of that was that believers had a share in the control. So they rejected the control of the bishops, who at the time were also backed by the state. We have to remember that during this time, church and state were married, they were in bed with one another, they were, it was hard to separate them. So listen, as we're going through this, listen to some of the thoughts and philosophies that have shaped culture. So, and especially with the Congregationalists, their way of thinking had some significant influence over the creation of the United States of America and our Constitution and how we function. And this was one of them, that the people that became the Congregationalists, they're not Congregationalists yet, but one of their early things was church and state are not supposed to be mixed up with one another. Okay? So they're the people that would become the Congregationalists, the early ones, they preached for a church where members had a voice. So this wasn't, kind of describing a hierarchical thing. This was kind of saying, it's the folks in the pews. So there were kind of two groups that eventually became the Congregationalists. One were the Separatists. So the Separatists believed that the only way to reach autonomy was to separate completely from the Church of England. They believed that the Church of England had just flat out gone astray, that there was no hope for it, it had been taken over by the devil, and they wanted to get away from it. So the usual claim for where this all began, and it's hard to pin stuff like this down because it's not always just one person and one thing. There's kind of a cultural shift that is happening, but the usual claim to where this separatist movement began was in a church in Norwich in 1581 by a separatist known as Robert Brown. And so they separated from the Church of England, and that didn't go over very well, and so they went into exile to Holland. Then in 1604, the first year of the reign of James I, there was another separatist pastor by the name of John Robinson who came to a congregation already organized at Scrooby, England, and he was responsible for the expansion of separatism into Congregationalism. So they've separated from the Church of England, and then this guy, John Robinson, brings in the idea of Congregationalism. He had been ordained by the Church of England. So he wouldn't have been, no, he was about 100 years before John Wesley, but they would have been colleagues 100 years apart because he was ordained in the Church of England. So he became acquainted with Brown's writings and he accepted his principles, but Brown kind of had this sense of anger about him. He had this bitter attitude. I mean, he was probably an angry guy that was part of his fire. Robinson did not pick up on and carry this bitter attitude. And so he was, I guess, I don't know, maybe the kinder and gentler separatist that became the Congregationalists. Well, lo and behold, things didn't go very well for them either. They were also exiled, first to Amsterdam and then to Leiden in Holland. A few years later, they would move to the New World where they could practice their Christianity. The word in the UCC history book was as English people. So years of delays and discouragement. The first band left Leiden in 1620. They were led by Brewster, Bradford, and Winslow, and they landed in Plymouth, Massachusetts, and they become known as the infamous Pilgrims, that we tell this story again and again and again around Thanksgiving time. So the other group that eventually became part of Congregationalism were the Puritans. So there were the Separatists and there were the Puritans. So their hope in getting back to the New Testament church style was through this sense of being pure. So they believed that they could remain with the Church of England and then purify it from within. And I gotta tell you, so when I was in seminary, there was a friend of mine that I had known before seminary. We ended up in seminary together, and we had, I don't know how many discussions we had about the best way to reform the church. My thing was, you reform the church from within. His thing was, you reform the church from without. And then you go back and read this, and it's like, we're still trying to figure out which is the best way to reform the church. It's nothing new. So they believed that reforming the church, purifying the church from within, that it would be enough if the churches were taken out of the hands of the bishops and put in charge of committees of ministerial and lay leaders or elders. And these became the Presbyterian Puritans. Then there was this active minority who believed that the only thing to do was to go the whole distance and give an honest measure of church control to local churches, including the adoption of their own local creeds or confessions. And these became the Congregational Pilgrims, or Puritans. They also settled in Massachusetts a few years after the Separatists. So last night, our exploration committee met. You know where this is going. Our exploration committee met to go over and review the suggestions that have come from the bishop, the Methodist bishop, about how to make sure that United Methodism is represented in our bylaws. And we have Congregationalists that are saying, And it is this same conversation, just the same. So y'all need to know that we are engaged in nothing short of a miracle. If we can, when we pull this off. So eventually, so now we have these two groups of separatists in the New World, in America, and eventually the Puritans, the people who wanted to reform the church from within, outnumbered the Pilgrims, the people who said, no, it can't be done, there's no hope. So the Puritans outnumbered the Pilgrims, and since there was no church of England to deal with in America at the time, their one big thing was no longer an issue, and so they felt like that they could come together. So the Pilgrims, or the Puritans and the Separatists come together to become congregational churches. I want you to hear very clearly that is plural. They formed an association of congregational churches. They did not form an association that became the Congregational Church. When you're talking about congregationalism, if you say, make reference to the Congregational Church, you're talking about a local congregation. If you are talking about the Congregational Church as a denomination, it's the Congregational Churches. And that's going to come into play. You're going to hear a story next week about how significant that becomes when we're trying to become the United Church of Christ. So there's the other teaser. You have to come back. It's a juicy story. It's good. So there's some notable people in the congregational churches that connect to the history of the United States. John Hancock was a Congregationalist. The Adamses, as in John and John Quincy, were Congregationalists. Harvard College was the first college in America. It was founded by Congregationalists in 1636. And the reason that Harvard College was founded was to educate clergy that were coming from England. The first church that I served was in West Haven, Connecticut, and while I was there in the mid-90s, they celebrated their 275th anniversary, which is not, and that was one of the younger churches. My colleague served a church in Bridgeport that the same year celebrated their 350th anniversary. In Connecticut, a town could not be chartered unless there was a church. So the churches were all chartered before the towns were. This church that I served in West Haven had in there tons of money that was like old money. A separate fund in their endowment that was called the Rising and Settling Fund. That fund was originally established to pay for bringing clergy from England to the United States to serve the church. So guess where they got the moving expenses for me to move from Missouri to go to from the Rising and Settling Fund? They still didn't want to spend it and had me do a self-move. Okay. Yeah.
So you're talking about Congregationalist churches on the East Coast there. Do you know anything about where the Unitarians fit in that? Because they were Unitarian churches set up?
There were, yeah, and I don't know my Unitarian history that well. It's interesting because I do know that the Unitarians and the Congregationalists, or the UCC through the Congregationalists, kind of have this little bit of a competition about, who really founded Harvard and who really did ordain the first woman. So, yeah. So we bump into each other with history, but I don't know their history. Sorry about that. I do know that sometimes the UCC is sometimes referred to as Unitarians Considering Christ. Okay. And And Jonathan Edwards. So Jonathan Edwards in the United States was seen as the orchestrator of the Great Awakening, which was this period of religious revival that began in the United States around 1730. What we see is in the formation of the United States and our Constitution, so a lot of the democratic methods that have become the basis for our American government came from some of these ideas from the Congregationalists, and that's, local. So we talk about local church autonomy. That's where our local state autonomy comes from. So it's kind of this same thing. And for the church, it was, we don't want to be under the rule of a bishop or primarily a pope or a king. And in the American government, it's that our states don't want to be under the thumb of the president, because that encourages the president to become a king. And we're done with kings. That wasn't a good experience for us, so we're done with them. There was a guy by the name of Horace Bushnell. So how many of you have ever taught Sunday school? Okay, we have a few Sunday school teachers here. You probably have Horace Bushnell to thank for having a Sunday school, because he changed the thought of how the salvation of children was viewed. So churches tended to insist that a young person was not a Christian until after having a highly emotional conversion experience. So, and that kind of led to the development of these big revival experiences. So we've got to save our young people. So we have these big revivals. And I've never been to a revival, but I've seen them in the movies. So you know that they're just these highly packed emotional things that are going on. And so the idea was to get the young people fired up so that they will have this conversion experience and be baptized and be saved. Bushnell comes along and says, no. So he promoted the idea that a child is to grow up a Christian and never know himself otherwise. And how do we do that? Sunday school. Yeah. So Congregationalists are known to also be pioneers in education and publishing, and church extension into social needs, home missions. So the Congregationalist home missions were primarily directed towards the indigenous, towards the Native Americans. And unfortunately, Congregationalists share some of the sad history of educating natives in ways that we have discovered are not good. Same with Hawaii. They were devastating. Congregationalists had a big mission outreach to Hawaii that almost devastated the Hawaiian culture. So that's, we have some not really good things in our history as well. So that's the Congregationalists, and we tend to have a lot of information about the Congregationalist history because it's kind of the big piece of the UCC that people continue to hold on to. And we've got a couple of UCC members here that will remind us again and again and again that the UCC is more than the Congregationalists. So here we go. One of those other streams was the Reformed Church. So remember I mentioned a guy by the name of Ulrich Zwingli, and I just like saying his name, Ulrich Zwingli. He had started the Reformation movement in Switzerland, and then attracted Germans to the Reformation movement that then traveled to the Rhine Valley. And I don't know my German geography, so I can't even tell you where that was. In the early 1700s, Germany was experiencing a time of chaos and hardship. They were they were deeply involved in the 30 Years' War. Louis XIV had armies that had invaded the Rhineland and devastated it. There was a section of poor harvests for several years. There was a severe winter of 1708, 1709, and they were also experiencing harsh treatment from the Roman Catholic political leadership at the time. So, what's a group of Reformed church people to do? Let's go to America. So, they packed up, they sought relief and freedom, and came to America. So there was a large group of immigrants in this around the 1709 time that came to America, and they settled kind of along the central eastern seaboard and back into Pennsylvania. So a lot of our historically Reformed churches can be located in Pennsylvania. What they found out here, though, when they got here, was that it was hard to find preachers. It still is hard to find preachers. So what they did is they would often turn to teachers to preach for them. And at one time there was a group of churches around an area, and I think it was Pennsylvania, called Faulkner Swamp. How'd you like to come from Faulkner Swamp? You know, oh, Great Falls, Faulkner Swamp. No, I'd go for the falls. So they asked this guy by the name of John Philip Boehm, and I'm guessing that's how you say his name, B-O-E-H-M. Yeah, we'll just call it Boehm, who was a farmer and had been a teacher. He was not ordained, but they asked him to be their pastor. So he agreed to serve, and he held his first communion as a non-ordained person at Faulkner Swamp on October 15th, 1725. There were 40 worshipers in attendance. So before we kind of came together, sometimes in the summer, during the year, if it was kind of a low Sunday, we'd be pushing it to get 40 people in worship. So they had 40 people in attendance. So Boehm then drew up a constitution, and the Reformed Church in the United States was born with a constitution. Then other small churches who also had difficulty getting pastors would reach out to him, and so he would travel to them and to do communion. But they were still kind of this scattered group of unassociated, non-connected people. They didn't really have any organization until this guy by the name of Michael Schlatter, who was Swiss, was sent to America by the Reformed Church of Holland. And his mission was to gather the Reformed congregations. So in 1747, there was a first meeting in Philadelphia, and it wasn't very big. There were 4 ministers, 27 elders from 12 congregations. Small things lead to big things. So then Schlatter also traveled to serve the churches like Boehm did, and he was touched by the sentiment expressed by the people at having the opportunity to receive the Lord's Supper. So they could go for months and months and months and not receive communion, and he would go to serve them communion, and they would just be so emotional about it. And so that really touched him. And so he went back to Europe to raise money for the aid of the churches, probably to help them get pastors. And he raised in those years' money $60,000. So I just did the conversion. In today's money, that would be $4.7 billion. Is what he raised to aid these Reformed churches. So yeah, what are you going to do with that money? So there was a boost, the churches grew, and one of the things that they did was to create a college, probably again to help train clergy in Lancaster. Lancaster Theological Seminary continues to be one of the seminaries closely related to the United Church of Christ. Eventually they broke away from the Reformed Church in Holland in 1793 and held its first synod of the German Reformed Church. There were 13 ministers, 178 congregation, and 15,000 members in this new Reformed Church in the United States, or the German Reformed Church. And it spread from New York to Virginia and then went west across the Allegheny Mountains, further on into Ohio and Wisconsin. One of the things that I noticed when I was in Wisconsin is that there were a good number of UCC churches who were formerly Congregational, Reformed, and Evangelical. We didn't have any from the other two stream of Christian or Afro-Christian. The German Reformed Church in the United States eventually dropped the name German because everybody was speaking English at this time. So that's the Reformed stream. Okay. Evangelical. We have somebody from the evangelical stream in our presence. Thank you, Elaine. So 300 years after the Reformation, 200 years after Congregationalism, and 100 years after the Reformed folks go to America, there was some stuff going on in Germany. King Frederick William III wanted to bring the Reformed and Lutheran branches of the Protestant Reformation together to have one Protestant church in Germany. However, at that time, Napoleon was on the move, and all of Europe was pretty anxious, pretty nervous. So the German immigrants, there were some people from Germany who said, we don't want to be here. And again, where they decided to go was America. So they journeyed to America. They went beyond the East Coast into the Midwest, some traveling by land, and some by traveling from New Orleans, north on the Mississippi, to St. Louis. There's a lot of historically evangelical churches in eastern Missouri and southern Illinois. It is thick. So there was a guy who was part of this group of German evangelical people who had come through New Orleans up to St. Louis on the Mississippi, settled about 50 miles west of St. Louis with a little group of evangelical people in a town called Femme Osage, F-E-M-M-E, Osage. So have you heard of the Osage Indians? This is where they had been. This guy's name was Hermann Garlich, and to say that like a true German, I need to spit on the people who are sitting right in front of me. And it's Hermann, 2 N's, Garlichs. He was well-trained, and he was a very well-to-do pastor. So when he got there, they asked him to be their pastor. He shared some similarities with that John Philip Boehm of the Reformed Church that kind of traveled around and visited people. At the time, he was not ordained, but he recognized the need of the people, and so he did some traveling around. He organized a first congregation that then was followed by many others. He was very dedicated to his work. He ended up organizing 7 congregations. And again, it was a situation where there were a lot of little churches that were just kind of independent of one another, but they were kind of drawing from the same cultural history and religious history. They were all had come from the German evangelical roots. But they weren't organized into an association of any kind. So this guy by the name of Louis E. Nollau, Nollau, came to the area as a missionary, and he was intending to go to the Indians out on the West Coast, but his traveling companion became ill and died. And so he was kind of left there in St. Louis. So, here you have a missionary with nowhere to go and nothing to do. He ended up becoming a pastor at a church at the Gravois settlement near St. Louis, and he recognized the need for these churches to become organized. So he sent a letter out to the neighboring ministers, and in October 15th of 1840, there was a meeting of clergy at the parsonage at Gravois settlement, and they banded together to become the German Evangelical Church Society of the West. And basically what they were was an association of pastors. That association eventually grew and became a synod, bringing in churches from Ohio and New York in 1866. And then it grew further with additions from northern Illinois and Wisconsin. They are also known, the evangelicals are also known for the development of schools and hospitals. So there was a hospital in St. Louis that was a direct descendant of this evangelical movement that took place. It was called Deaconess Hospital. So the evangelical church, where Jolene was born, I heard that. So the evangelical church had nuns, had sisters who were celibate, who took vows, who lived at Deaconess Hospital. So there was a wing of the hospital which was where the sisters lived. So when I was in seminary in St. Louis, I did what's called clinical pastoral education at Deaconess Hospital, and there were still about 10 sisters that were living there, and so one of our jobs as student chaplains was to go and do Sunday chapel services at the hospital, and so patients could come, staff could come, and the sisters were often there. So that the sisters were basically our congregation, because they were the ones that were the constant. They were fun, and they were interesting. So we've done Congregational, Reformed, Evangelical, Christian. So the Christian stream is a clearly American development. There was actually kind of three events and related to 3 people that happened kind of around the same time. I'm looking at my dates. I don't have dates on all of them. That were kind of similar in what they were, and then they eventually came together. So the end of the 18th century, so the late 1700s, early 1800s, there was religious dissent going on still. There's always been religious dissent. If anybody tries to tell you that church conflict is something new, do not believe them. There's been a conflict in the church ever since there's been a church. There's been a conflict in the church before there was a church. One of those early conflicts was, I love hearing about what people are conflicted about. One of the conflicts in the early church was whether or not you had to be circumcised in order to be a Christian. Because it comes down to, did you have to be Jewish in order to become Christian, and the way that you became Jewish was to be circumcised. So when Paul is talking in some of his letters about circumcision, it was a real thing. That was the conflict. Thank God we no longer have on our membership application, have you been circumcised? Thank God we no longer have to check that out. So in Virginia, there was a guy by the names of James O. Kelly that got together with 31 other ministers that left the Methodist Church in protest against the growing authority of the bishop. There it is again. They were saying again that the Bible is a sufficient rule of faith and practice. They called themselves the Christian church. It's this thing of, there's no better name than Christian. Speaking of church names. And that kind of spread through the South. Around the same time in Vermont, there was a guy by the name of Dr. Abner Jones. He was a Baptist layman. So yes, there are Baptists in New England. So the American Baptist Church kind of emerged out of New England. So when we hear about Baptists, we often think about the Southern Baptists and go, ooh. But there was a whole other Baptists in New England that are progressive, open and affirming folks. So keep that in mind whenever you hear Baptists, that there's two kind of flavors of Baptists, and they're not all Southern. So this Baptist layman, Dr. Abner Jones, revolted against the Calvinism of Congregationalists that came from the Calvin branch. So the Calvin branch is kind of the Presbyterians, and the Baptists, and he led this group of dissenters. And he also took the name of Christian. So we've got, kind of the Southern Christian Church, and now we have the New England Christian Church. And then from that, a guy by the name of Elias Smith founded the first religious newspaper in the United States. It was called, at the time, the Herald Gospel Liberty, and then it eventually became the official communication of the Christian Church and became the United Church Herald. So I don't know if you've ever heard of that, but so we have some journalists in our background. And around the same time in Kentucky, so we've got Virginia, Vermont, and then Kentucky, a guy by the name of Reverend Barton W. Stone and the Reverend David Purviance withdrew from the Presbyterian Synod of Kentucky. They were disturbed by the rigidity of the Calvinists, and they pleaded for more lay leadership. They also called themselves Christian, and they were known for pioneering educational opportunities for women and for co-ed colleges. So keep in mind, this is in the early 1800s. And I didn't put it down. Somewhere along the line, as the Christian church came together, these kind of three movements came together. And I need to look up to determine, so how is this Christian movement related to the Christian Church Disciples of Christ? Because they are. I do know that they claim some of their heritage through this Barton Stone and through Thomas and through James O. Kelly, but I need to go back and look that up. So there's the four streams. Those are the four streams that any of us who went through confirmation in the United Church of Christ would know those, would have been taught those four streams. So what's this fifth one? So this fifth one is the Afro-Christian Convention. So let's go back to the days of slavery in the United States, and what would often happen with the religious practices of those who were enslaved on plantations was that they were required to attend the churches of their masters. and they would often be in the balconies of the churches. Many of these churches would have been Anglican or from the Church of England, so there was a big Anglican movement going on in the South, and there's a great book, and I cannot remember the name of it. It traces, when you look at the United States, if you were to map out in the United States kind of the cultural, social, political regions of the country, there are distinct areas, and they have this interesting history about how it relates to immigration, how it came to the United States. So New England and the Northern Atlantic tier states are referred to. This guy that wrote the book. Try not to walk in front of the speaker again. Most of them, are related to the Congregationalists, related to the Puritan or the Presbyterians. Highly valued education. Education was kind of the cornerstone of building a good society, and so that's where we have all the Ivy League, most of the Ivy League colleges, and education is really important. In the South, the Southerners originated out of people that came from England who were not nobles, but wanted to be. And so they found that there was this opportunity by moving to America that they could become their own kind of sense of nobility. And so they went to the southern United States because the northern tier was occupied by people who your success came through education. They wanted to have success through lineage and land ownership. And so they settled in the South and obtained land from the indigenous. And the way that they would become nobles would be by becoming lords, essentially. And in nobility, lords have their power because they have the serf culture that serves them. And the idea being that in the feudal system, the lord is, master over their domain, and the serfs serve the master, and the master then in turn provides for the serfs. Well, there weren't any serfs available, and so they had to import them. And that's slavery. So they imported the slavery into the South. So that's where the connection in the South to the Church of England was, or the Anglican Church came. So anyway, the slaves were required to attend the white owners, their master's church, and often those white preachers would cherry pick the biblical texts out that talked about slavery and talked about how, good slaves are supposed to do this, and it was just horrible indoctrination, flat out. At the time of the Emancipation Proclamation, there were a group of former enslaved people that said, this is no longer going to be our religion. And they started their own churches. So they were, I'll get to my notes. They were often lay-led because education was not a thing, but they were lay-led by people of color, by former enslaved people. They discovered that the Bible actually said a lot of different things. They were becoming educated, so they would be able to read and be able to learn that themselves. By the turn of the 20th century, in this Afro-Christian convention, there were 150 churches, 25,000 members, 185 ordained ministers and licentiates, so licensed ministers, and 150 schools located in North Carolina and Virginia alone. They grew their strength out of preaching against the dehumanizing system of slavery, and basically at the time of emancipation, they talk about leaving the balconies of the white churches, because they literally left the balconies of the white churches. They bought into the ideas of James O'Kelly, the Christian guy who opposed the system of slavery, and the white Southern Christian Convention did not. So they became this Afro-Christian Convention in 1892, and then they merged with, and I didn't know that this existed, there was an association of Black Congregationalists. So this Afro-Christian Convention merged with the Black Congregationalists in 1940 to become the Convention of the South. So when, and I'll go, this is jumping ahead a little bit, when the United Church of Christ formed in 1957, this was a big conversation with, this was a big conversation that this Afro-Christian Convention had at the time, was whether or not they wanted to become part of this newly forming United Church of Christ, recognizing that the majority of it were whites, were white Christians. And so that was a really kind of a big gamble that they did. So those are our 5 streams that eventually become the United Church of Christ. We'll go into how that all happened and what each of those streams brought to the table next week. We have 7 minutes for questions. Notice we have 7 minutes for questions. I didn't say answers, but you can ask your questions. We'll see what happens. Rosemary.
I missed one stream. I've got Reformed, Evangelical Christian, and Afro-Christian.
Congregationalists. Thank you. This has been fun, so fun we'll do it again next week. Anything else you want to say?
I'll get Methodism to America.
You'll get Methodism to America, and I'll get the 5 streams will come together into one. Okay.
Since you're recording this, is it available for people who couldn't come today?
Yes, that was, we had requested it be recorded. We haven't figured out where we're going to put that recording. We can put it on, let's put it on YouTube. We'll upload it to YouTube and get the link out for people to go and watch it on YouTube. Okay. Okay, thank you. Thank you to Eric. Oh yeah, Dana.
Just out of curiosity, is there a reason we don't use the Nicene Creed as much as it was when we first were introduced to it?
Personally, there's some wonderful history about the Nicene Creed and the Apostles' Creed both. There's some hard history about those beautiful writings. The hard history is that they were used to say who is in and who is out. And for the Congregationalists / UCCs, having a creed that says we believe is contrary to that idea of local churches being able to develop their own creeds and doctrines. When I learned about the history of the Nicene and the Apostles' Creed, I was appalled, because it really was used to say, if you cannot say, truthfully, I believe this and this and this and this and this, you're out. You are not welcome at the communion table. You cannot be baptized, all of that kind of stuff. And for an inclusive church to have something that's historically been the gate to let people in and out, that's challenging for me. Anything else? If I was going to be here longer, I think it would be fun to do an adult education class on the creeds and learn about their formation, why they're there, how they've been used, how they've been misused and abused. Yeah. But no. No. I've already started to get my pension payments, and I'm due to get my first Social Security check next month, so it's like, no. No, not going to happen. Okay, thank you all very much. See you around.